So Masa and Marco are from San Diego City College, as you know, but last meeting we had during last month, we were sharing tips and tricks around how to move forward and maintain momentum around guided pathways in general, and then of course in this new virtual environment. So we're really excited to have Masa and Marco sharing out their Scrum meeting techniques and how they've been applying it in the GP space. Hopefully this will be really informative and informational to you. So we'll turn it over to Masa and Marco, and feel free, Marco, to share your screen at this time.
All right. Masa, did you want to start?
Sure. Marco has been the team leader for the Stay on the Path team, which has evolved into a collaborative support team, which will be piloting soon. We are developing training materials now. Even before we transition to to online environment as a result of the current public health crisis, Marco has found this technique, and we have been doing this in person. Then when we switched over, it became more useful in some way. It can be adopted to do it virtually and also in person, and it's really productive. We can focus on things that we need to do, and our district finally slowly switching to Office 365 also helped, because we have found additional tools to make it super cool. So Marco?
All right. Thanks, Masa. I won't be able to see if anyone has a question, so if you guys just want to shout out on something in particular, and then Masa, remind me to go to Teams 365 at the
All
end.
right.
So,
okay.
So what I have here is, I'm just want to give as quickly as I can kind of what Scrum is, and then a short story as to why we started using it. So Scrum comes from, it's a project management, I guess, method, but it originally comes from software designers use it to create software. And they began doing it because their normal process was do all the planning up front and then go ahead and do the work. Then you have a product. Hopefully it's what you originally designed and what the user wants. But because things move quickly now, they needed to be able to be flexible and change things as they went. And so this Scrum process is something that they've been using for a long time. And then I discovered it by just listening to a podcast that I occasionally listen to. And then there was a book and I read it, and it was from an educator. And I have those resources at the very end of this that I can share with you guys. But it comes from just a method of working that's similar to design thinking, if we're familiar with that concept, where you do some planning, you bring stakeholders in, and you have a team of people typically that don't all work together normally. They come from various parts of an organization, and you need them to be able to produce something, whether it's a product or it could be just a way of thinking or some sort of something at the end, but you need to get them together and coordinated. And Scrum describes a process for how you do that, and then it also describes a tool that you can use to do it. And so using the Scrum method, the reason we began using it in particular with guided pathways was I started with our work group from the very beginning, and this was maybe about 2 years ago. And as a lot of us are familiar with, normally when a group gets together, you set maybe a once a month meeting, and maybe you meet and talk for an hour and a half in that, but nothing really happens in between, and you do that for a while, but you don't produce anything. And so when I came across this particular method of working, I was already interested in, let's try something different. So I described it to them, to our group, and the way Scrum works is that typically software designers would meet every day. They're usually in the same building, and they meet every single day for a 30-minute, what they call Scrum stand-up meeting, where they answer 3 different questions, and I'll go through them, and they're on this page here. But what we did that is we applied it to a weekly meeting, a weekly 30-minute meeting, because we wanted to meet more frequently, and we wanted to be able to have a time and a space where we could all get together. And this is when we could still meet in person, and actually talk through some of these issues. And our main question was, what does it mean to stay on the path? And that's a long story that's led us to here. So it solved a few problems. It gave us a method for working and a way to record the work we were doing. And then it also gave us a time and space to actually get together, because we thought everybody can find 30 minutes in their day once a week to meet. And so for the most part, that did work. And we used a real loose framework of the Scrum process that we are now fine-tuning and trying to apply to our collaborative support teams this fall with a group of people on campus. But for Scrum, a couple of the main components of it is these are some definitions and rituals. So these are activities that always happen regardless of the time frame you're working with. So the first one is the sprint. This is just your time frame. So you get to decide. If it's software design, it's like 4 to 6 weeks typically. For us, we just kind of defaulted to the semester. We knew we have a semester where we are going to kind of come up with a question or a concern or a challenge, and we want to start working on it bit by bit. And then at the end of this sprint cycle, or the sprint, you have to demonstrate the work that you've done, and then also you review your own process to see how it went. And it'll follow some of those 3 questions at the bottom. So there's our sprint. We have our time frame. So the sprint always starts out with a planning meeting where you outline essentially your priorities. What we're starting to do now is we're using the logic model as kind of a framework for that, where we begin kind of coming up with a central problem and question, and then we use the logic model template to help us build out objectives, some of the things we want to assess so we can see progress, looking at our resources. So we use that right now. But that would occur at the very beginning, and that's usually a little bit longer meeting. We're looking at probably a 90-minute meeting where all team members can come together and you begin working on this together. And so we have now that at the beginning. Now from there, you set up your schedule where you begin meeting once a week. In our case, it was 30 minutes, once a week for 30 minutes. These are called a daily scrum. We use it as a weekly scrum. So every week we got together. During those meetings, really the only thing that you can do, or you should do, is you answer 3 questions, and those are at the bottom of the screen here. And these questions never change. Everyone gets a chance to answer them, and there really isn't any back and forth dialogue. It's everyone goes through, you can take notes on them, but it's a way for us to kind of hold ourselves accountable from week to week, because you only need to accomplish one thing based on what our kind of initial meeting was set out to be. So the questions are here. What have I done since our last meeting to meet our goal? So what we decided on in the planning meeting. What will I do this next week to help us meet our sprint goal? And then the third one are, what are some obstacles that might impede my progress? Or really you're asking is, where do I need help? And so part of the Scrum process is normalizing doing incremental work and also asking for help at the same time. And so people can kind of see around, the different members of your team can do that. And then what we've been doing in practice is once a week, we've answered these 3 questions. And then we've also used kind of the last half of our 30 minutes for us to actually dialogue back and forth. So we kind of do a prioritize some of the issues or items that we're working on, because really that was kind of the most unique aspect of when we started working and using this method. Was we set aside a small amount of time each week where we could actually be in person and talk to each other. And then in between those meetings, we left knowing that I'm going to be doing this, they're all doing this, and now next week I'm just going to accomplish one tiny thing. That was the idea, to make us feel good about we only accomplished one thing. Kind of like, you know, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So you might have this big goal, but you only need to be doing progress little by little. And so part of the way that we organize these meetings and answering these questions, and we have our planning meeting, is something called a Scrum Board. And I'll show you kind of a representation of what that looks like at the end. But it really is, its simplest form, it can be an Excel sheet or a piece of paper with 3 columns. It's, let's see if I remember correctly, it's going to be, it's a to-do column, it's in progress, and then it's finished. And so everything that you kind of set out in your planning meeting, or if you're using like a logic model, you have activities, those kind of become your to-do items. So that's a long list. And your idea is to take one to-do item each week perhaps, and you move it over into in progress. And you don't pick up any more to-dos until you've completed this one and moved it into the done. And each time you do that, you mark the date that you started it, You put your initials to know who's working on it. And then when it moves over in the done column, you do the same thing when it's completed. That way, at the very end of your sprint cycle, everything that the team has done and everything that everybody's contributed is already recorded, no matter how little or large. Usually they're all little tiny things. They're all recorded there. So when you go back, so that leads us to the demonstration of work. At the end of every sprint cycle, regardless of how far you got, if your main goal was this really big thing, but you got halfway there, you just do your demonstration of work because you can reset your sprint cycle to continue working on it. Maybe something happened during your sprint cycle that you had to kind of bob and weave and be flexible, some new thing or a funding issue or something you thought you had that's not there, and maybe you didn't get as far, but that's okay. The point isn't really to do that. It was really to make progress on something that's a really big goal. And so the demonstration of work, you have all the stuff that you've done, but what you do is you take what you have and you share it out with your stakeholders. So the people that it impacts, you want to share out, and they're going to give you feedback on it, which you can then use to inform your next sprint cycle. And then the very last thing that you do is this thing called a sprint review, where you then, everyone in the team gets together and you really talk about how the process worked. Were we able to meet as often as we did? When we did we have any issues with our 3 questions? Were there problems meeting? With our team, that's always an issue, is depending on what type of employee you are on campus, it may be easier or harder for you to be available for those 30-minute meetings. And that was something that always came up, but we were able to share those with kind of administrators or managers in relation to the work we were trying to accomplish. Was there a way to make time so that we could do some of this work? But those happened there. And then what you do is you focus on 1 or 2 things to improve the next time for your next sprint cycle. So that's really for the team's chance to kind of look at self-reflection as to how did we do? And so these are kind of like the basic outline of what's really been driving our progress from the initial question, which was just what does it mean to stay on the path at City College, to all the way where we got here with our kind of team concept that we're going to try to prototype. And so I think the biggest things that were different for us that our own team members said was, wow, this seems to be working. And one of the differences was we met every week for 30 minutes. We had this recording system, and we really emphasized just accomplish one thing at a time. And so we're taking this method and we're trying to formalize it for other folks on our campus to also kind of help them make progress within their own. Right now, our team's around an academics or an academic school in conjunction with student services and instructional faculty. And so this picture is from one of the books, but it kind of just shows a representation of that whole process from the very beginning. On the left-hand side, that's your preparation, where you do like a planning meeting, but now you have your whole sprint cycle. Within that cycle, you're doing your daily or weekly scrum, whatever you've decided. And then it shows kind of you're doing your review. Retrospective is the demonstration of work. And then you're repeating the whole thing, but you do that over and over and over again, making changes, getting feedback, so that you can accomplish a big goal in little tiny spurts. For us, the way we applied it is we didn't necessarily, like our big goal was student success, so it wasn't very well defined, but we were making progress slowly but surely. So some progress was better than no progress. And so now and now at the end, we have a much clearer idea of what we were doing. But this kind of really helped us kind of drive us forward and working a little bit differently than what we would normally probably default to. And this here is kind of what a Scrum board might look like. You can use an Excel file, which is what we've been using this entire time. And then we are now starting to use Microsoft Teams 365 application. It has an app that can duplicate this type of format, but this is a little bit more in depth, but some of the main items here are the objectives column would come from your planning meeting. These are kind of the big things you wanted to accomplish that will allow you to reach what your goal is for the sprint. And from there, those objectives will be tied to activities. So if we're using the logic model format, activities would be listed in here, and that's where you can pull these to-do items. So those have to be tied back. So everything kind of flows. So a to-do item can't just float by itself. You have to be able to tie it back to where it came from based on our planning meeting. And so then as you work on one to-do, it could be as simple as I sent an email to Wendy Smith today. And you just put that in there. That was a to-do. You moved it to in progress as soon as you sent the email. And when Wendy gets back, it's in the done column. It's as simple as that's all we wanted to do, was to encourage just doing something, at least initially when we began working. And so as you move all the way over, you get this nice big long list of everything there. And then the backlog column on the left is, let's say an idea comes up in one of our meetings. It's somewhat related, but it didn't make it into our original plan, and we don't want to forget it. You can stick it in this backlog column, and that way it will get recorded and we can carry it with us for the next sprint cycle. And so this was just this is something we're working on now to kind of help explain when we do a training with members of our college about what the Scrum Board is. But you can use an Excel file for this. So that's the Scrum Board. And these are just some of the resources that, if you're interested in learning a little bit more, the book by Rebecca Pope-Ruark talks about agile faculty and how she is thinking about it. I've used this for just myself, this method of doing just projects. I did it for like planning my class for the year. So you can do it yourself with the to-do and progress and complete. It's really easy with one person. It gets a little bit harder when you have more people and there's a much bigger idea, but it does work really well for working differently using the same amount of time, just a little bit different. And then there's a podcast that's about, I'd say 40 minutes, that also it's with the author describing this process as well. So it gives you a little bit more background into it. And then there are 2 websites that they do certifications and things like that, but they have some resources on Scrum, primarily kind of in the business realm, because moving it into higher education is very new, but those are great resources in terms of definitions and how meetings work and resources for facilitating these types of things. And what I didn't really get into here was when you're meeting in that daily or weekly Scrum, there is a process that goes on. There's a facilitator that helps facilitate through questions and move things around. The facilitator helps maintain the Scrum Board so that it's organized and then it flows from the planning meeting. And so there are a few main roles there. Stakeholders would be there. If it was software design, it would be the person who requested like an app to be developed. In our case, we are using deans and chairs at the moment, and VPs as stakeholders. Those people can attend these meetings, but they don't get to say anything. They're just there to hear how the team is working, and they can communicate with the facilitator about things that may be on the horizon. So that's how we're kind of applying this method there. But that's what I have here. That was that last slide. So we'd love to be able to take questions.
Oh, Marco, you want to show how we are recording now on Team 365? It kind of shows the process. The software itself accommodates the process that you have explained in terms of recording, moving things around. And it flows really well with logic model thinking as you plan immediate activity to eventual goals that you're setting. Each of these, short-term, long-term, mid-range goals can in itself become a sprint, and it can carry over things that were not completed or couldn't complete for various reasons. That becomes new priority, or maybe you find out it wasn't a priority, so you can kind of revisit your plans as well.
And I saw the chat too. People said, is it an acronym? And then someone mentioned rugby. So Scrum does come from, it's a rugby term for when both teams get together and they're in that huddle and they're trying to get the ball. And based on what I learned, they applied it to this method because in order to get the ball, when these 2 teams are hitting each other, the one team has to coordinate all their efforts, and each player has a different role. So in order to get the ball, which is the goal and possession, you have to be coordinated in this very chaotic, ever-changing environment. And so Scrum kind of describes that on how we can work on our campus, or our campuses. All right, let me see. I'll share one more time. So this is our Microsoft Teams area. And when you go in, if you have this particular type of program, you can make several types of teams. But when we started out, we created one for developing our training for a collaborative support team. And I'll just show you, there's a lot of little things you can do here. But what we did was we created our own Scrum Board. So there's an application that you can add on to Teams.
It's called Trello, right? I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's called Trello, and it's an app you can use on your phone. And actually, if you listen to the podcast, they mention it as a tool that you can use. I think on this one, it does. So it'll load. And so what we did is, Trello is similar to how a Scrum board operates. And so it gives us these nice columns here. And so what we tried to do was take the logic model format and some of those terms and apply them to our Scrum board, so that when the team does its main planning, it can take those, it pulls the logic model information and that makes it into the Scrum board. Because one of the issues we came up with when we were first working was we had a planning meeting, and we usually created some sort of outline, and we kind of, from that outline, we started our work, but it wasn't as formal as making sure that we were following the outline altogether. And so what we did was we were formalizing our planning meeting using logic model as a tool and pulling the information. So objectives, those are things that would get you, a team would create in their logic model. They'd have an overarching goal or a question that they're trying to answer, and they would come up with some objectives. And from that, they would pull activities they believe will help them achieve the objective. That's where we pull to-do items from. So the Trello board's nice because if you click these, it's fairly interactive. So then these checklist items become our to-dos. We're still working out because it's a little bit different than we use in our Excel sheet, but these are our to-do items that we can add or subtract. And when we complete something, we go in and you can mark it there. And typically what you do is if I finish this one, I'd put my initials and I'd put the date that I did it. That way it's recorded in there, and then I can save it. And that way, once these are all completed, let me get out of here. So once these are all completed, this would move, the way we're organizing it in our head, it gets a little tricky, sorry. Once there's one item here, this would move into our in progress column, and it would be here. And we try to make sure we complete everything in that area before it then gets to move into our done column. And so we're working out how to take different technologies and kind of make it work for us. But so far, it works fairly well. It was just standardizing some of the language for us. But this way, it keeps us on track. So we can't start any work if it didn't originate from our original planning meeting. But if we have an idea that comes up, another term they use is a parking lot for backlog. So we just called it a parking lot. So if anybody has an idea that they just kind of say in a meeting, it's not quite what we talked about, it's not related, but we think we want to work on it, we just stick it in there. That way the next time we have it recorded. And the main thing was really recording everything that the team does in one place. We had been using a Google Drive and sharing folders, and it was a little clunky. It wasn't great, but we think that since we have access to Teams 365, this will be the one place where we can communicate in between our meetings, because we really wanted to emphasize that the meeting part is to touch base, share ideas, do a little bit of conversation that we don't normally get. But in between, we can now use something like Teams 365. It has a chat feature, so anybody on our team, I can talk to anyone directly or a group of us together. They can get back to me whenever they feel like it. It can be on your phone. But now we can save everything in one place. This will be easier for us than using our Google Drive has been.
This is amazing. So thank you so much. We did get a question from Christina in the chat. So can you please share the links on your presentation?
Yeah, I can share them now, and I can share the presentation afterwards. I can email it.
Did we have any other questions? Other things that popped up during the presentation for anybody? Thank you for that, Marco. I did have a question in terms of, it was good to see the application of kind of where you've taken your project. I'm wondering if it might be a good resource. I loved that blank template But just to maybe populate that at some point, to give folks an example of like how they could apply it to GP work, I think that would be really phenomenal. So I might reach out to you all to see if we might be able to do something like that. But this is wonderful. And as Wendy was sharing in the chat as well, our organization has also gone over to Teams and is using it a lot in this virtual environment. So we love seeing that tie in because we'll probably be using it too on our end.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Does Canvas not have the same? So here's my thought, and what I find not only with my students, but with working with people on campus is we're tired of having 6 windows open to do our work. So, you know, as an instructor, I have to open especially in this online environment, I have to open Canvas to be with my students. I have to open Zoom. I have to have my email open. I don't need another thing to open. But so I guess my real question is Teams that much more powerful than what we already have, that it's actually worth the effort to have another window open on my computer?
I think so, right, Marco? Because we originally wanted to use Canvas to do the training for the collaborative support team as a pilot. But as we start using these things, it's really flexible. It's really easy to communicate with everybody. We actually start putting contents in there so that we are teaching people to use this Scrum process in their, you know, small team environment. At the same time, we are using the software to teach them how to use it. So I have used Canvas to do like a data advocacy stuff that we've done last summer. It kind of works, but it wasn't what I was looking for this particular project, especially the project management aspect of it. You know, since Canvas is a learning management system, not necessarily a project management system. So I think it's really worth it. What do you think, Marco?
Yeah, and we chose it for a couple reasons, because what we liked about it was that we could house everything that we had been doing in one place. So instead of having, because what we were doing was we were communicating by email, and we've determined that no more communicating by email, because that use it for other stuff, but it's not effective to do that. And so we thought if we could have one spot, even if it was another application to use it, you can use video on it as well. So you don't have to use Zoom. You could just immediately be in there and video with somebody. If they're on, it'll ping them right away. So that was one thing. We haven't done that yet, but it has that. It has the chat feature, so it saves it in one spot. So I can, instead of just texting someone on their phone, I can just text them there. They'll get it whenever they log in. So if everybody knows the norm is to just go in and you're doing your work asynchronously, since this is what we're doing now, we needed a place to do that. And so this kind of gives us that one stop for everything. All of our files can now be saved there, so we don't have to use Google Drive, which, you know, whoever has privacy and somebody changes the settings, some people could see some things, some people couldn't. And then we were losing information as well.
That's my follow-up question. So is anybody having an issue with using Microsoft Teams? And here's my issue: is my laptop's a Chromebook. So I don't operate Windows and I don't operate Mac. I'm Chromebook. So mine, you know, seems to favor Google. So are you finding anybody having issues with using Microsoft Teams in, let's say, Chrome or any other places like that? Because when I download stuff on my Chromebook, it goes to Google, it goes to my Google Drive. So and that's a personal issue, but some people have, you know what I mean, when you're talking about technical issues and things like that. So I'm just wondering if you have anybody coming up with that, or if that's something that I'm just gonna have to think about moving forward.
Yeah, so far no one has told us from our group of about, what, 6, 7, that they've had an issue, depending on what kind of computer. I'm sure we will probably have issues like that in the future. And we're also thinking too, if our office computer will have it, eventually we would be using it from our offices too. But no, we haven't yet. I'm sure we will. And then I think someone mentioned, Wendy, you mentioned Slack, using that. And so the thing about the Teams is it has essentially a version of that now too. So it's just in one spot. And so that was one of it's not gonna be perfect, but the one thing it solved for us was it puts everything in one spot for us. and it was easy to add people because as long as you're in the system with the college, it finds you automatically. Because once you log in, it's just your school's, your regular login.
And I'm in the same district, so this could be a total personal issue that I'm gonna have to figure out. But
Yeah, actually, Tony, I've been doing a lot of research on Microsoft Teams because I'm part of my implementation work group with my own organization. The thing is, because it's a Microsoft 365 product, it's also web-based too. So in case you can't get the exact Teams application downloaded and installed, you can use the web-based version, and it's got like the full functionality of it as well. So yeah, between that and on the phone, and yeah, I have run Android and have MS Teams installed as well. It's been very, very helpful. And I think just the decluttering of the inboxes and being able to see like a full thread of conversation about a particular topic and project that we're working on has been really helpful. So I love this integration. Thanks so much, Masa and Marco, for sharing that today. Any other last questions as we actually get close to the hour here?
I was wondering if the two of you would be willing to give kind of a monthly or twice monthly report about how it's going, how it's evolving, what obstacles have you encountered, what seems to be working best. I'm really curious about it. And I think that later it might be a really cool conference presentation.
Yeah, we can do that. Because this will be our first attempt to teach other people how to do it. And we think it will work, but in keeping with the spirit of how the planning process is working, it's not supposed to be perfect. And so it's okay to start something without maybe having the full picture, because we just want to make this incremental progress. And so going into it, we know we will be, so I'd like to use the word prototype instead of pilot. Our campus likes pilot, so that's what we said, but we're really doing a prototype because we're going to tinker with it, and we'll tell our team that we're training that we are tinkering with how you're working, because once we train you and you work, we're going to be observing how you work, because we think it will work this way, but it probably won't.
A process accommodates 3 different frameworks, as Marco mentioned. Design thinking, that helps a lot. We have adopted that framework in developing various ID pathways, concepts, and practices, and so on. Logic modeling, we have been doing that ever since the start of this whole project. LFM has adopted some of these, teaching of logic model, and some of us had non-teaching professional experience doing that as an evaluator and so on. And it kind of fits really well. So it's a nice package deal. Going back to Tony's earlier question, it kind of combines 3 things we're using, as Marco mentioned. So you would have 2 less windows, as you can keep everything in there. You can communicate through chat as well as Zoom. If you're being zoomed out, chat works pretty well. And, depository of everything that you do, it's recorded there, so you don't have to deal with searching for things in your inbox or archive. So, and our district is moving towards Office 365 anyway. So.
All right, so thank you both.